Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
No, good to be here, and thanks for having me. It's good to see everybody that are here. Good to see some of the names that are on Zoom, and yeah, good to be among friends during what has been a not my favorite winter, frankly. But yeah, I hope everybody has been. It sounds like there's been some cool local birds around that folks have been enjoying. So hopefully, you've been seeing those and enjoying some birds in the yard or, at home in a field as well. I wanted to talk about this group of birds, seabirds, and we'll talk about what those are. They are near and dear to my heart. Um, gotcha. Keep going. And yeah, I think to a whole swath of birders, it's like a kind of an unknown group. Um, I think anytime you talk about getting on a boat, you can almost cut the number of people in half, the number of birders that will actually go out on a trip. If you say, hey, we're going to go birding today, everyone's like, cool. If you say, and we're going to get on a boat and spend all day looking, from birds on a boat, about half of those folks be like, you know what, you guys go do that. I'm going to go do something else. Personally, I love being on a boat, almost without exception. And it feels like a real frontier out there in many ways. There's a lot of mystery, there's a lot of romance, and it's just a great group of birds. And many of them eat squid. Almost all of them will eat like little pieces of squid. Some of them actually hunt squid, and that's where the title here comes from. Real birds eat squid. Uh, I've done a number of Southern Ocean trips, and that's kind of a common chorus you hear, particularly about albatrosses and some of the larger tube noses. Um, and there's really four main groups we'll talk about in explore. Three of them are pictured here. The three main groups are albatrosses, petrels, and shearwaters, and then there's two families of storm-petrels. So here we have black-browed albatross, which to me is kind of like one of the real classic seabirds. For me, it's like our winter pelagics that we do around here. This is my white whale. Like someday we will get a black-browed albatross on a Hillstar pelagic around here. Man, that would be like utterly amazing. The pintado petrels, that black and white kind of medium-sized tube nose there, a really beautiful bird, also often known as Cape petrel. Pintado means painted, and they kind of look like they've been splattered with paint across the back. And that's a common tube nose of the Southern Oceans. And then Wilson storm petrel is the little guy there. And that is one of the most widespread birds in the entire world. And let's see here. I am trying to advance. Not succeeding. Arrows. Enter. Hmm. There we go.
Yeah, but how did I do that? I think I just clicked.
Okay now that all right, maybe it was sleeping or something. Just to make sure. Yeah, there we go. All right, cool. Thank you. So yeah, this is really an ode to seabirds. These are the bullet points that the group, the things that I thought would be fun to hit on. The romance and rules of the sea, the intrigue of seabirds, why they are so interesting and fascinating. Being at sea, pelagic birding, what that's all about. Then I thought I'd share some of like my personal highlights that kind of over the years of seabirding, and then talk a little bit. I'll finish with a couple places that we go at Hillstar, places coming up. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Karen Blixen, who's wrote Out of Africa and Babette's Feast. The cure for anything is salt water, tears, sweat, or the sea. And I think I don't know, the sea has just an incredible romance to it. And it's, there's nothing like being out at sea. And so we're going to talk about that. This is a mottled petrel, which is one of my favorite seabirds in the world, Pterodroma inexpectata, because it could appear almost anywhere. In fact, there is a record of this bird from Suffolk, New York in like 1898 or something like that, showed up in a farm field. This is a bird that used to be abundant and only it breeds on like a very few islands in New Zealand, but then disperses long distances in the Pacific. How one ended up in a farm field in Rye, New York in 1898 or whatever it is, I could not tell you, but I'm guessing weather was a big factor. So when you go out to sea, there's a lot of stuff you see that is difficult to explain, right? And as a result of that, a lot of mysteries have arisen over the years, a lot of fables, and it's a place of paradox, the ocean. It's like so famous, so well known, but also there's so much that we don't know and so much mystery and things you see that maybe it's some little animal surfacing briefly or a distant water spout or whatever, and you end up with lots of fables to explain these things. And in the course of putting this talk together, I did actually do some research and found out that 57% of Americans believe in the existence of Atlantis. 57%. So I'm looking around here and I'm wondering who the Atlantis believers are in this room. Yeah, could be. 10% believe in mermaids. 10%. Looking at you, Naveen. So yeah, I couldn't find numbers on the Kraken, but the Kraken is another one. There's many other such fables. There's Davy Jones lockers, all sorts of weird stuff. And a lot of it is, I think, is just hard to explain what you're seeing out there. It's a weird and wild and woolly place. It is the biggest habitat on Earth. 71% of Earth's surface is covered by ocean, and we've explored very little of it. I think over 80% of the seafloor is still unmapped, and only about 5% of the ocean has actually been explored. And roughly 20% has been mapped by more modern sonar technology, but there is a lot for us to discover. And I think, we're thinking about birds all the time, but we're always thinking about the ones that we see in our backyards, that we go, to this state, that state, whether we're going to get our chaffinch here, or we're going to go get it in Europe. But yeah, maybe you could get out on the Atlantic Ocean, probably on a cruise ship. But it's the 71% of the Earth's surface is out there. That's a lot of real estate. And of course, it's not just about the birds. On these pelagics, there's a lot of other wildlife to see. Cetaceans, which are the whales and dolphins. Some really big fish. When you're talking about pelagic fish, these are often the ones you're talking about: swordfish, tuna, various tuna, mackerel, and some sharks. And of course, there's sea turtles out there as well. So there's a lot of charismatic stuff to see out there. And I always like to say that anybody that turns their nose up at an owl or a whale is simply a bad human being. And I do believe that is true. And if you think about it, like almost any person you meet, if you tell them they have a chance to see a whale, they get excited. They're like, I want to see that. Whether they're into nature or not, if they have a chance to see a whale, they're game. And whales just have something else. And we could do a whole different talk on them. But personally, one of my favorite things about these trips is getting to see cetaceans. In particular, you can see some really rare ones. This is not that uncommon an animal, but this was a Cuvier's beaked whale that Jess Koss photographed on one of our trips in New Jersey a couple years ago. We weren't really even sure what it was at the time. Females are a little harder to identify, but with this image, we were able to tell later. And sometimes you see some really, really rare stuff, that are not birds. But yeah, it's a unique habitat. You're talking about these seabirds. They go to very remote islands, is where a lot of them breed. You're talking about ocean currents, various depths, sargassum. We're going to talk about that a bit more. Blue water versus green water. Inshore, we got mostly green water. You get out far enough, you get into the blue water, which is not as nutrient rich, but there's currents out there that birds and fish use to travel. It's really a different thing once you get into the blue water. It tends to be a lot clearer, it tends to be warmer. So it's sometimes you hit that change really abruptly. You can see where the green water and the blue water divide cleanly, and it's there. Sometimes there's birds just lined up right along that change. So the pelagic zone, as mentioned, is the largest habitat in the world, and it relates to the upper layers of the ocean surface. I got a graphic here I'll show in a second. But there's a bunch of birds and fish that are associated with this zone that you don't really see outside of it, except for the birds when they're breeding. So here is this chart that shows there's kind of four depths, zones of depth for the pelagic zone. Where the pelagic zone begins offshore kind of depends a little bit. Most people say it's kind of at the low tide mark or where the shelf drops off, and I think that varies depending on location. But it's basically, often people say the littoral zone, the coastal zone is the first few miles, sometimes up to 7 miles is where the pelagic zone begins. But again, it really varies depending on where you are. But you can see there's kind of four different layers to it. There's the abyssal layer, there's the midnight zone, which is the bathopelagic, the mesopelagic, and the epipelagic. And of course, the birds are pretty much always on the surface, although there's quite a number that actually will dive down and pursue bait fish, particularly shearwaters, and some of the larger petrels will do that. And the ocean is made up of these currents, and I think we don't think about this a lot, unless you go offshore. Here, where we are, a lot of the pelagics we do, you've got the Labrador current coming down from Labrador and from the north, which is a cold water current. And then for us, the real defining current is the Gulf Stream. Seldom on the pelagics do we do around here can we actually reach the Gulf Stream. If you go down to Cape Hatteras, you can, about 40 miles out usually, you can hit Gulf Stream water, sometimes even much closer than that. But around here, we often got to go out like 90 miles or more, and we are just looking for little spinning eddies of the Gulf Stream. But you can see that the whole North Atlantic there kind of goes in a clockwise motion in terms of the currents, and that governs a lot. So this is just a little bit about my seabirding background. I got started in 1998. Leading pelagic trips off Cape Hatteras. That's where I really did a lot of my pelagics. A lot of you know Paul Juris has done a lot of pelagics down there as well. And I got involved with Brian Pattison, who's still doing trips called Seabirding. His trips are called Seabirding, I think it's seabirding.com. And you can go out and do trips with Brian. That guy and holding the binoculars there and looking at the whale's blowhole is me in about 1998. And this was like one of the craziest experiences I've ever had. We were in a pretty fast boat called the Country Girl, which is a famous pelagic boat down there. And we were heading back inshore at the end of the day. I think it was like 2:30 in the afternoon or something. We're heading in, we're going like 15, 16 knots, which is pretty fast on these boats. And all of a sudden this thing surfaces right next to us. And it followed us for about 20, 25 minutes. Just, like dolphins bow ride, but it's a whole other thing to have like a 35, 40-foot sperm whale, kind of riding along with you. And at times you could have reached out and touched it with a broomstick. He was just curious about us. And you could see him, he'd swim over on his side. You could see his eye looking up at us. And I never heard about anything like that before. This was one of the first trips I ever did. I've never seen anything like that since then, from a big whale. Everyone was talking about Moby Dick and, some folks were a little bit nervous, but I think that experience really just cemented pelagic birding for me as something that any day you go out, something really unexpected, that can happen here, but it's such a much bigger frontier offshore. You just never know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to see. Some days it's pretty slow and boring and kind of punctuated equilibrium where you're waiting for the surprise bird to show up. And other days it's amazing. So this is just kind of a little rundown of the birds that we look for and that are routine on the North Atlantic pelagics. The Wilson storm-petrel, or the Mother Carey's chicken, as it's known, is kind of a staple of the summer trips in particular. Almost virtually all of them come from Antarctica, and then they spend our summer up here. And yeah, so we're looking for these storm-petrels, Wilson's, leeches, band rumps. Band rumps are getting split in a bunch of different ways, so that's complicated. And then there's shearwaters. Sargasso is what was formerly Audubon's, Sargasso, shearwater, Manx, great Corys, Scopoles, and Sooty. And then these petrels, the pterodromas, which I think are kind of the real, to me, they're the Ferraris and Lamborghinis of the bird world. They move really dynamically and are the most fun to see. And then there's these rarities which show up, on really odd days. Plus, there's your tropic birds, your Jaegers, your pelagic and tropical terns. These are the kinds of things that we look for on these pelagic. These are mostly the summer ones, all these birds virtually. Some could be seen in winter. And then you never know what's next. There's other rare things that could show up. Jamaican petrel hasn't been seen since, early 1900s, late 1800s. It's disappeared, bred only in the mountains of Jamaica. And it was closely related to black-capped petrel. But has not. I think this is maybe the lone specimen or one of 2 or 3 specimens of that bird. This is a mounted specimen from Jamaica. That bird, nobody knows what's happened to it. It's kind of, you talk about a white whale. That's one that folks hope that could still be out there, that might turn up someday. At this point, it seems pretty unlikely. But it was a very large petrel, much bigger even than a black-capped. And here's your black-capped petrel. So I thought we would talk about what a seabird is. To me, this is, again, one of the quintessential ones that we have around here that we look for. And this one you could see was actually got up off the water reasonably close. They breed on the island of Hispaniola. Many of them in Haiti are not really able to breed there anymore because of deforestation. Most of them breed high in the mountains, in burrows in the ground, and there's more habitat for them on the DR side, but they're in big trouble. This is a bird that we used to see on my first pelagics out of Hatteras. Some days we'd have over 500 in a day. Now, if you have, double figures, if you're into the dozens, you're doing pretty good. If you get triple figures, that's really a red letter day. So they just are not around like they used to be. And a lot of that is habitat related. But they are a classic seabird. And so what is a seabird, right? Gulls, everyone talks about seagulls, right? That's kind of, everyone thinks of those as seabirds. But really, if you look at seagulls, many of them are temperate, many of them are lake birds, and some of them hang out on beaches, but a lot of them are landfill birds. But if you actually go a couple miles offshore, there's relatively few gulls. On these winter pelagics we often attract gulls. But if you're to go, out 12 miles or something, or even 6 miles, a lot of those birds drop off pretty quickly. So gulls, for our purposes today, I would say are not seabirds. Same with terns, even though, the bridled tern is a bird that really is one of the supreme aerialists in the world. When they fledge as youngsters, they take off. They may be on the wing for, 3, 4, even 5 years before they land again and to breed. But aside from that, they spend their whole lives on the wing. They're amazing aerialists, and a lot of that time is at sea. So you could certainly argue that they're seabirds. Jaegers spend a lot of time, basically almost all their non-breeding time at sea. Same for many phalaropes and certain ducks. But I would, for our purposes, I would say these are the seabirds, the tube noses. And they really, as I mentioned, they're in 4 families. You got your albatrosses, your austral storm-petrels or southern storm-petrels, and your northern storm-petrels. And then the group that I think is probably the most exciting and certainly the most diverse is the Procellaridae, the petrels and shearwaters. These numbers are conservative in terms of the species here because seabird taxonomy is vexed, and there's a lot. We're learning a lot quickly. One of the paradoxes with this group is that it's a very well-studied group, and yet a ton remains unknown. They're even still discovering new species on occasion, but they're certainly splitting. A lot of birds that we formerly thought were one species, band rump storm-petrel, as I mentioned, is a famous one where it's becoming clear that there's multiple species, if not many, involved, and they basically look all the same. So these birds also present some of the greatest identification challenges of all birds. And here again are representatives of the four different families. You've got the northern storm-petrels with band-rumped Wilsons belonging to the austral, the procellaridae, the petrels and shearwaters represented by the Corey's shearwater, and a white-capped albatross here from off of New Zealand. So those are, when for our purposes today, and I think in general, when people really are talking about seabirds, usually they're talking about tube noses. If you go into Peter Harrison's book, especially the one from 1987, which was like, that was the seminal field book, on seabirds. Prior to that, there was almost nothing. There was a book from like the 1930s, but these birds were practically all fables and legends. But Harrison's book in 1987 was a landmark book. And he updated in 21, a fabulous book, and I'll reference it at the end for anybody that'd like to pick up a copy. And I think it covers. Got a copy here? Oh, really? Heavens to Murgatroyd. Marty, you should have brought, and shared with everybody. But I think that book has 435 species spread across 9 orders and 18 families. And that's his version of seabirds. And Steve Howell has a book called Oceanic Birds. I think it even includes a couple gulls like Sabin's gull, which winters largely at sea. In my view, these are the real seabirds, the tube noses, although certainly reasonable arguments could be made about others. And these involve some of the most rare and little-known birds in the world. This was an Atlantic petrel. We had a day on an Antarctic cruise I did a few years ago where we had like 50 of these. And when I went into eBird, there was very few images of these. And I was so surprised how few images there were. But these birds breed only at Tristan da Cunha, basically, and I guess neighboring Gough Island. They basically only breed there. If you were to draw a point between Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, right smack in the middle of the Southern Ocean, that's where these things breed. They're about as far from anything could be. And it's not a super large population. And when they're away from their breeding areas, they stay really far offshore. So, these are birds that you just don't get to see very often. And that's why there's not that many images of them. This is I don't know if it's the most sought after bird among seabird enthusiasts on the East Coast, but it is certainly up there. Has anyone here seen a Bermuda petrel? Yeah, not surprised. I've only seen 2, and I totally messed up the first one. It was like totally my fault because I got distracted by a Sabin's gull. It was like 2 rare birds showed up at once, and someone was like, I've got, what's this bird? And I was like, don't worry about that. There's a Sabin's gull over here. And then they took a photo and showed it to me later, and I was like, oh my God. It was a cow is the other name for cow is Bermuda petrel. But we didn't see the photos till we got back to shore. And that was a very painful lesson. 2 rare birds at once. That's not supposed to happen, But this is a bird that was thought extinct for 150 years. And what was it? I think 1951, David Wingate found a couple were breeding still at Bermuda. And they have done a tremendous amount of conservation work there. I think there's over 300 of these now. And it turns out that North Carolina is actually a pretty regular place for them to spend their time away from breeding areas. They usually start to pair up in November, and they're seen on pelagics off North Carolina in particular from May, June, July, and I'm not sure about August so much. And there's even a few records north of there now. It's certainly one of the ones that we think about offshore. And it looks like a black-capped petrel, but smaller with a darker cowl, and they're quite petite. This is another one who was thought extinct for about 150 years. I think it was 2004, Brent Stevenson and Sav Seville were out and saw this little storm petrel that looks kind of like a Wilson's, but white below with all these crazy streaks. And they got some photos of it, and they we realized it was this New Zealand storm-petrel that hadn't been seen in over 100 years. And I took this photo, 2 years ago. And you can now go see them, and they've even tracked them to one of their areas where they breed. They just figured out where they bred, I think, just in the last couple of years. So there's these kinds of things that are still out there. So what makes a tube nose a tube nose? Well, let's start with the tube. And that you'll notice that in these different groups, they have different kinds of tubes. But to me, this is one of the prototypical ones is the northern fulmar, which is in the petrels and shearwaters group. And it's got a big tube right in the middle of the nose. And that's how these birds process salt water and get their water, is they've got these glands kind of they're in the head. It's kind of between, I think, near the eyes, and they kind of function almost like kidneys. They extract the salt and some other waste products, and they allow these birds to process salt water, get fresh water out of it, and then they excrete it out that tube. And you can even see it on some albatrosses and other birds when they're flying along. You'll see like a little, I'll call it tears, but some might call it snot, that kind of hits the sides of the cheeks, and some like wandering albatrosses in particular will end up with these kind of little rosy pink spots on the sides there from staining from the excretions. But they do have a really strong sense of smell. Most birds do not have a particularly strong sense of smell. Tube noses can smell, rotting fish at the surface, or they can pick up all sorts of smells from a great distance that most other birds cannot. And of course, they got a nice little hook on the end of the bill, because a lot of them are eating fish or squid. A lot of them feed at night and wait for these vertical migrations of fish to come to the surface. And that's when they use that hook, and maybe even diving after some of these fish and squid. And they have really long, narrow wings, because they spend so much time in the air, and these webbed feet for the pursuit diving. So those are a few characters.
Fulmar means smells.
Yeah, is that right?
But in the other sense, it's
you mean like it stinks?
It's a defensive mechanism. They vomit this fish oil that stinks.
Yeah.
So fulmar is foul, and I don't know what the mar.
C.
And
Mar is C.
Yeah, right.
And Art, as you may remember, the giant petrels, which are kind of in the same group. I think they're in the fulmarine group. The giant petrels, they're called stinkers. Like, that's one of the names by the fishermen and the guys that were doing the seal harvesting. They got a big tube on their nose, and they are really expert projectile vomiters. And they can hit you with a big dollop of oil from, I think, 9-12 feet away if you dare to get too close to them. That's interesting, though. I didn't know that. I didn't know that about the name of fulmar. But yeah, these are some other characters of tube noses, or seabirds, as we're calling them today. They're long-lived. Many they vary. They can be sedentary, nomadic, or migratory. That depends on the species. Within each group, that is true, that they can be any which way. There are examples in each group. They're pretty much all monogamous, and they form strong pair bonds. They have low reproductive rates, so that's all of that goes together, right? Including the elaborate courtships rituals. If you have to invest a lot, and if your breeding takes a long time, like these albatrosses, these waved albatrosses on the Galapagos, they have these really stereotyped courtship rituals that they go through. The pair bonding matters a lot, because one of the members of the pair is going to go off for a week or a month, and you're waiting for them to come back and spell you on the egg or to feed the chick. They really have to invest in each other, these seabirds, more so than a lot of other birds, because they live a long time, and there's a lot that goes into raising these young. So I think that's part of the romance in the story of these birds, is that their behavior and their life history. A lot of them are citizens of the world, and that's impressive, right? They don't really, a lot of them wander so widely that's impressive. But the breeding habits, particularly of these larger tube noses, I feel like makes them really interesting, and you feel for them, because it's such a bleak existence in so many ways. Yeah, so this is an example of a long-lived bird, and I got to consult my notes on this one because I want to make sure I get it right. But Manx shearwater is a really cool bird. It's probably our most unpredictable seabird, up there with Fulmer on the trips that we do around here. We have trips where I never expect to see a Manx, but some days you might see 15, and then you might go 3 or 4 trips in a row where you see 0. I don't really know what the deal is there. I do think we could probably time it better. But it's probably the best known because they breed in Great Britain and the British Isles there. So it's a well-studied tube nose. It does breed locally in Canada as well. And a couple of classic marks are they have this little white curly Q up around behind the ear coverts there. That is atypical in this group. And they have white undertail coverts, and they're kind of a medium-sized tube nose as well. And yeah, as I mentioned, you can kind of see this is the distribution. One of my Antarctica cruises, we ended up starting in Buenos Aires and heading down the coast before heading out to the Falklands, and I had no idea how many there would be off that side of South America. That's actually a large percentage of them, but most of them, the name Manx comes from the fact that they breed at the Isle of Man in the UK. And the first North American records were recorded in 1973, breeding there for the first time, and now they've been found at a number of spots. They're increasingly found in the Pacific Ocean. In fact, I'm trying to remember if that picture is from Maryland, but I inadvertently photographed one in the Galapagos a few years ago that ended up being the first one for Ecuador. I was photographing just tons and tons of Galapagos shearwaters going by, and all of a sudden I was looking at my photos later, and I was like, oh, wait, that one's different.
Just after you left 2 or 3 years ago, we got the second record for Bering Sea.
For the Bering Sea. Wow.
So I don't know if they're coming over.
Yeah.
Or they're breeding there, we never know.
I think they must be breeding someplace over there because they're regular now off California, and they're seeing them pretty much all up and down the Pacific coast from the Chilean side too. But it's a cool bird. You notice the scientific name is Puffinus puffinus, which is it comes from the Middle English word puffin, which means the cured carcass of nestling shearwaters. The Atlantic puffin actually acquired its name much later because they think of probably similar nesting habits. But this is the one I wanted to talk about. And I bet you some of you have heard about this. This is the story of AX6587, Boston's most famous Manx shearwater. And it was late spring 1952, and that was the band number of a bird, this AX6587. And it had a fateful meeting with a guy named Rosario Mazzio, who's the gentleman there you can see. And he was an amateur ornithologist, and he was on an island off Wales, and he wanted to do this experiment where he caught a couple of these Manx shearwaters that bred there, and he took them in a box, and then he flew with them to Boston. And unfortunately, one of them died along the way, but this one survived, and he took it from Logan, it was from Logan Airport. He arrived at 8:15 a.m. on June 3rd, and he let it go and watched it sail off that morning offshore, and it was back at Skolkom on June 16th. So in just little less than 2 weeks, that bird was back at the colony. It knew exactly where to go. It had traveled 3,050 miles in 12 days, and it must have been averaging about 250 miles a day with no landmarks to guide it, but it knew where to go. And that was when people first started to get a sense of the navigational abilities of these birds. And just, I don't know if you'd call it intelligence, but what they can do is amazing. And for a while, the oldest living bird known in the world was a Manx shearwater too. There was one that was trapped in 1953, and it was retrapped in July 2003. So it was known to be at least 55 years old. So that, as we mentioned, longevity is something that's known, and this has got to be, the most famous. Well, among the most famous birds in the world is wisdom, and it was banded by the late Chandler Robbins, who was down at Patuxent in Maryland, and was a great man. He also pioneered the breeding bird survey, and just a fascinating guy. And he banded this thing in 1956, and I forget when they first relocated wisdom, but it was decades later, and I think they had to remove the band and put it in formaldehyde or something, and because they couldn't even read the band. And all of a sudden they realized that this was a bird. Chan realized that it was a bird he had banded and that it had been decades, and she's still going. She had young last year. She at least had an egg last year. I don't hear if the young fledged or not, but wisdom is still going strong. So these are some other longevity records in birds, and you can see how long these things live. And for some, these are just the ones we know about, right? Like fulmars might live much longer than 46 years old. European storm-petrels, tiny. They're like this big. It's like a little wind-up toy, and they can live 33 years. Ashy storm-petrel also is not a big bird. I mentioned the Manx shearwaters, 55 years old. The great albatrosses, which are the wandering and the royal, those are the biggest flying birds in the world, 11, 12-foot wingspan. And this is a southern royal that's photographed here. And they don't know how long they live. Like people say they're probably over 100 years old, over 150 years old. Who knows? Nobody knows because we haven't been banding birds that long. This is a wandering albatross here. Yeah, and as I mentioned, it's got the largest wingspan in the world, and they take a long, they live a long time. They take a long time to mature. Most of these big albatrosses take 10 years before they actually would try to mate for the first time. And one of the famous examples is the short-tailed albatrosses, which just breed on a couple islands off Japan. They're one of the populations there. They breed at the base of this volcano that erupted, and many of them were wiped out, and they thought that this population might never come back, but they forgot that there was 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds that were all offshore at the time, and they repopulated, and that bird is doing tremendously right now and is coming back. But it's these things that what they do. When they have young, they might travel 10,000 miles. They might, as I mentioned, they might be gone 4 or 5 days on feeding bouts, but they could be gone for 10,000 kilometers or more and cover tremendous distances. And they actually gain weight while they're at sea, which is weird. And I'll try to show a video here in a minute, but once they lock those wings in, they don't really have to do much work. They just let the winds do it. They'll reach speeds of 45 miles an hour, and they use pressure gradients. And in addition to wind, they use pressure gradients and gravity above the swells to soar for many thousands of miles. So this is where I was hoping to show that video. And yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to talk about, that was that many of these things are using infrasound. Let's see, you'd have to X out of this. That's a difference. Yeah, there you go. I think it's up here, right?
Not good.
Oh, really? Oh, looks like.
Sure.
So maybe I'll hit the volume. Oh. Does that mute just the video, or does that, hopefully the Zoom people can hear me still?
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of looking pretty pixelated. What I was hoping to show is how when they lock those wings in, this is a flock of Salvin's albatrosses near their breeding area. And I'll try to play the video again and see if it comes in any better. But once they get going, it's really not much work for them. And I think we watched these birds. It was an amazing scene. It's just unfolded for, 6-7 hours afterwards. The where's the quality?
Yes, spinning wheel, then go to quality.
See if that works. Hopefully I didn't just shut down.
The internet's very slow today. We'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they just spin around and around like that as they're flying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I should try to find one where the bird is bigger in the frame too, because I don't know that it'll resolve very well. Yeah, but I think what's crazy is you're watching dozens and dozens of birds like this, and they never flap. Like you never, these birds are moving at an incredible rate, but they don't flap once. And that's how they travel. So they have this like little bone where their ulna is, and they can kind of set it back and lock in the wings, and they can shut down half their brain so they can sleep while they're flying, and they just go. This is my friend Mary Kimberly, and this is off New Zealand. Some of you will, at least Marty, will see this. Hopefully, the same scene unfold later this year, where basically thousands of these salvage albatrosses, and this is another one that ranges widely. But and this is true of many of these birds. They breed on just one or two islands, and then they range widely.
Yeah, Perpetuals can lock in on.
I would think so. I think so. I think gannets actually do the same thing. The charodromas. So let's see here. Let's try to hit that. And how do I get back to gracias? Yeah. So thinking about how these things navigate, and that was one of the things I was hoping to show, but the video, I'll have to work on that video to get that better. But the microbaroms are these very low frequency sounds between 0.1 and 0.6 hertz. I think most people can hear up to 20 hertz or something. And they can hear these hum of these microbarom infrasounds. They call it the voice of the sea, basically waves crashing together, stuff that we could never ever hear. And they use that to detect where there's wind, and then they move towards that wind because that's what they like. That's where they can lock those wings in and go. But it's one of the amazing things about these birds is that they're picking up stuff that we just can't even fathom. This is the largest known flying bird ever in the world. It is extinct, guys. It may come as a surprise. And the name there's an ornithologist named Stores Olsen, who's kind of like the authority on fossil birds. And he said that this was the most unimaginative name ever applied to a fossil, because this is Pelago-ornis, which basically means sea bird. So Stores Olsen was not impressed with the name of these things. But you can kind of see on the bottom kind of right of your screen there, that's a wandering albatross. And then this orangish beige, I don't know what color that is, peachy beige bird is the Pelago-ornis. And you can see it's like twice the size, about 24-foot wingspan. This is another image of that. And I don't know, I just like thinking about, some of these fossil birds, these birds, the prehistoric birds, are incredible to think about. This thing's probably snatching penguins and big fish, who knows. But basically the biggest flying bird ever known was kind of a crazy looking albatross. I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure how long ago that thing went extinct. Don't know if I have notes on that. It says the early Pleistocene, to the early Pleistocene. So I think I went through these, but these are kind of the real characteristics. When you talk about a tube nose, what are the features? that make a tube nose other than the tube. It's these other things that's long-lived, they're monogamous, they have this elaborate courtship and strong pair bonds. The dynamic soaring, which I tried to show in the video there, but hopefully you get a sense of it. Some of you have probably seen video of that before elsewhere. The dynamic soaring is unique to this group, and they really do these big roller coastering. Yeah.
Online, we are still seeing the video. For the people online, we are still seeing the video.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's not that great a video, so I'm not sure. Maybe we
Hit stop share and then share again. And
yeah.
I think it was just a poor
Let's try that.
connection, making everything lag.
Yeah, I keep getting notifications here that the internet is a little slow.
Stop here for a sec. Go back to share.
I got to show those guys the Pelagiornis. Video stop?
Yep. It's looking
Yes.
good.
Okay. Okay, good. Thanks. Here's the Pelagiornis. And then here you can see it kind of, here it is. Here's it is silhouette compared to an albatross.
Hold on 1 second. Still slow.
Okay.
Taking a while to go.
It's loading up.
There we go.
Gotcha. Yeah, so here's the Pelagiornis compared to an albatross, 24-foot wingspan. Yeah, I think if that thing showed up on a pelagic trip, we'd all be heading for the cabin and telling them to floor it for home. But yeah, navigation by infrasound, the diet of the fish, squid, krill, and the marine zooplankton. And carrion, often a lot of these birds will feed on, rotting carcasses at the surface. The dynamic soaring is a big one for a lot of these birds, less so for, say, the Storm-Petrels, but certainly for the other ones. So preparing for a pelagic. This is that same trip. There's Jess Koss. It was the same one. She got her photo of the whale. Yeah, I think folks that are heading out to sea, these are things to think about. If you're heading out and haven't been offshore before, learn the names of the ones that you expect to see. I think people get really fixated on the rare stuff, and then you get out there and mostly you're seeing the stuff you expect to see, and then people aren't as prepared for that. So prepare for the more expected birds and try to get a sense of the structure, which is, a term that marries size and shape. Those are pieces of advice. Seasickness is always something people ask about. And never exactly sure what to tell folks, but yeah, being well rested, not boozing too much the night before, and keeping outside, keeping your eyes on the horizon, fresh air, all of that helps. And then hopefully having some birds around can help as well. Bonnie.
And if you're getting seasick and you take Dramamine or another thing like that, don't keep taking more of it because it's not working, because it actually makes you sicker.
Yeah, and usually those seasick meds you're supposed to take, before you get on board. Start the night before with those meds. Often I like to say portable foods. You often want one hand for the rail, one for your binocs. So apples, and little packs of crackers and so forth are good. Ginger foods are popular. So yeah, these are a few things I always recommend to folks, but being well rested is one of the best things. And I always like to talk about the superstitions at sea. And some of these are deemed to be, good luck, or it depends on the circumstance. Like throwing a stone or a coin is that's supposed to be good if you're you're coming up on a crossing someplace, maybe a rough spot where you're throwing something for the gods to bless your crossing. But if you throw like a stone or a coin as you're leaving port, that's supposed to be really bad luck. So you don't want to do that. Killing an albatross, that's obviously bad luck. They're supposed to be, a sign of good fortune. And you can, those of you familiar with the Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, he talks about how it is the worst kind of luck to kill an albatross. Whistling is no good because you might whistle up a storm, and that is one that I am subject to doing at times. I will sit there whistling away. And then I've been on boats. I remember one in particular where I kept getting dirty looks from some of the Russian guys on board that were not particularly pleased with my whistling. Bananas are that's a not intuitive to a lot of people if you haven't been offshore, but if you have, you probably, and you brought a banana. I like bringing bananas personally, but it is frowned upon for multiple reasons. They're just generally thought of as bad luck. Like if you came across a shipwreck, often all you'd find were these floating banana crates. So people would say they had a bad association for that reason, but also because if people were shipping bananas, they'd find spiders or sometimes, venomous snakes in the crates of bananas. So they didn't like that. And also they give off, ethylene, I guess, and that can make things like fish and other fruit rot faster and spoil the rest of your cargo. So bananas are generally verboten. People don't like those. And yeah, some of this, like black cat on board, not good. Women, priests, and redheads were definitely discriminated against and thought of as bad luck for a long time. I'm happy to say that era is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The color green, not good. Discarding shells is like eggshells. If you do it, you're supposed to like not just throw them overboard after you crack them, but you're supposed to cut them in. You're supposed to like crumple them up into like little bits because they say like evil spirits, in particular little witches, will ride the eggshells back to the boat and then haunt the boat forever. Passing the salt shaker, I feel like a lot of folks probably know that one, right? You pass the salt shaker, you put it down. You don't hand it to somebody. You put it down and then they can pick it up. Otherwise, that's bad luck. Setting sail on a Friday is no good. Set sail on Sunday, that is good stuff. You're all good to go. But yeah, there's, again, weird stuff happens at sea, so people come up with weird ways to explain stuff. And this is just kind of a look at what we're dealing with when we go offshore. You can see the Labrador current there, the cold current coming down, and then it kind of goes down and peters out below the Gulf Stream, which is a warm water current that comes up from the south. And that often brings some of the birds we're looking for from the Gulf of Mexico. It is also it does move pretty quickly off to the northeast there. Does anyone know who discovered the Gulf Stream?
Franklin.
Yes, I was going to say it was maybe the most famous Philadelphian ever. Yeah, Ben Franklin. Yeah, and he noticed that he heard that like on ship crossings that on the way back they often got back like a day sooner than they would sailing there, and so the guys started keeping track. They put a thermometer overboard and they try to keep in the hot water on the way back because that would keep them sailing faster back to shore. And here you can kind of see the red water obviously is the really hot water. And off Hatteras, you can see where North Carolina is. You don't have to go far to get out into that. And Hatteras is great because you can get some cold water coming down there off Manio. So there's that can be good for another set of birds. But the hot water, sort of some of the sexier seabirds we're looking for, is often out in that Gulf Stream current, like the black-capped petrels, the other pterodroma petrels, your tropical terns, and they spiral out and make these eddies. And that's often what we look for up here. When we go offshore, very often we're heading for these canyons, and those kind of get out about 90 miles to get. That's where you get some deep water, and you get some upwellings around those canyons that can produce aggregations of nutrients and food for fish that then attract birds. And they're very good. They're well-known fishing spots as well. You can see just below Baltimore Canyon there. I think it's a little easier to see here. Below Baltimore Canyon is Poor Man's Canyon. That's often where we end up on the Maryland pelagics we do in the summer. Most of our trips are out of Maryland or Delaware. The Jersey trips more often go up north to Hudson Canyon there, which you can see is a larger canyon. People talk about the Bermuda Triangle, but really there's this circle, and that is named with that's what the Sargasso Shearwater is named for, and it is what the Sargasso Sea is named for. And sargassum is important stuff. It's like a real nursery habitat for sea turtles and I think 86 different species of fish or something. They've got those little pockets which make it float. So you get these huge masses of it. and it is really important habitat. Often we'll find redneck phalaropes associated with it, and Sargasso shearwaters will feed along it. So if we're out on a summer pelagic, you're always keeping your eye on those mats because there can be fish around that, and then they can attract birds as well. It's a brown seaweed, a brown macroalgae, and it is really good stuff. The American eel has a crazy life cycle, but a lot of them go way offshore into the Sargasso seal, and some of them spend quite a bit of time in the Sargassum until they get a bit older and head back inshore. This is kind of what I was going to compare our winter trips to our summer trips here just briefly, because I know some folks have asked about that. The summer trips tend to be overnighters, much longer, 18 hours. We go much further offshore. That's why they're longer. And these are kind of some of the birds we look for, and some of the mammals. The great shearwater, which is pictured here, is one of my particular favorites and is a real Atlantic coast special, and I think is a great looking bird as well. And you can see again, here's the map. Those two little dots in the bottom there are Tristan da Cunha and Goff, and that's where the bulk of them breed. There's some that breed in the Falklands as well, off down to the left there, closer to South America. And it's just amazing that there's 5 million pairs. That's where they breed. That's like, you see this again and again with seabirds. They're just breeding a few small islands, and then they disperse widely. There's many that do this. I often say the big bird on our winter trips is the little auk, also known as the dovekie, and these tend to be shorter trips, 8 to 14 hours, usually 8 to 12, and we stay closer to shore because we don't need to go so far to find these alcids, the dovekies, the puffins. We had a trip last weekend, had 40 puffins, a couple hundred razorbills, and a couple hundred dovekie. We have yet to miss dovekie on any of our winter pelagics, knock wood. That trend will continue. It's an amazing little alcid. It is the smallest alcid in the world, and you can see where they breed. It's way up north, those pinkish orangish areas. It is a really northerly breeding alcid, and they just kind of, the map here is from Birds of the World. It shows them petering out around Cape Cod, but we get them every winter on our pelagics around here pretty much every year. So some of the rare stuff we look for and hope to see, I got to be on a boat in 2004. That's actually the day I met Tom Johnson, was on that boat, and he was a young kid at that point, and we had, this is Nick Bonomo's photo from a different day, but it was an amazing day. It ended up being the first North American record spotted by Brian Pattison. And I just remember him saying he was looking out at this bird. It was with some Cordy shearwaters, which it looks quite similar to, but it's smaller. It's got a grayish bill. And he kept saying, something's not right with that bird. Something's not right. And we rolled up on it, and we got really good photos of it. That was an exciting bird. Swinhoe Storm-Petrel, the first really good one, was spotted by Michael O'Brien. I was sitting just right above him when he spotted that. I think there might even be fourth record for this now for North America, and there's a few other kind of questionable or provisional type records. But this is a kind of medium-sized shorebird, kind of a notched seabird with a notched tail, and you can see it's got these white primary shafts right in the base of the primaries there. That's a good character for that bird. And it's all dark, right? It's got a dark rump. So that was a very exciting bird we got to see in 1998. European Storm-Petrel, the first one that there's some really old records, from 1970, and I think even from maybe the late 1800s, there were a couple records of this bird. And then it was, I think, 2005. Yeah, it was 2005. Brian Pattison was going through some photos, and he found this photo of the bird. He was like, oh, man, I think it's European Storm-Petrel, but the photo wasn't really good. We couldn't be sure. The next year we came back. We had dueling pelagics at a couple different ports off North Carolina, and I was with Matt Hafner and some others, and I remember Matt spotting this little bird. It was like a wind-up toy. Compared to a Wilson Storm-Petrel, this is actually a much smaller bird, really herky-jerky movements, and we had two that day, and the other boat had one as well, and we ended up having three all in one day after none for decades. And they've had a few since then. They had a couple of years in a row where they had some more, but that's another fun bird to look for. Here are a couple of the trips we're doing coming up that will focus on seabirds. In particular, this Alaska cruise I'm doing, I really am hoping to connect with short-tailed albatross. I've mentioned them a couple times. The youngsters are all chocolate with these big pink bills. Those are most often what you see up there. And whiskered auklet, a lot of people say is maybe the hardest bird to see, or maybe the most expensive bird to see in the North American continent, because you have to go out to Dutch Harbor to see it. And so that's where our cruise begins, actually. And that's where we'll look for that little bird, that little dapper little alcid. Galapagos trip, I've done quite a few of those, but I've got one coming up next year. I didn't picture as many seabirds here, but I think that the land iguanas there, which looks like truly a modern day dinosaur, is one of the coolest things we see there. But the seabirds really steal the show. Everyone talks about the Darwin's finches and the mockingbirds, and those are cool, especially the mockingbirds. But the seabirds are really, really good looking, and they steal the show most places you go. And this is another one coming up. Some folks here are coming on this trip, so that'll be a fun one. And again, I went to here, decided to picture some non-seabirds, Cobb's wren, and the strided caracara, also known as the Johnny Rook. If you're looking for a good book, there's one called A Most Remarkable Creature, and it's about caracaras. In particular, the Johnny Rook is featured. The author is also a musician. I think he's the lead singer or guitarist from the band Shearwater. It's a band from Austin. It's a good band from Austin, but he's also a really great writer.
Jerry?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's right?
Oh, those are blackish synclodes. Yeah. Yes. Or tussock birds, as they call them there. Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect. Good spot for them. Yeah. Yeah, a couple other birds. The yellow-eyed penguin, some say, is the rarest penguin in the world. Look for on this sub-Antarctic New Zealand cruise. White-headed petrel. To me, it kind of reminds me of it's like the black-capped petrel of that part of the world. It's a really big, beefy pterodroma. Structurally, they remind me a lot of each other. That's about the end of it. And then this petrel station, Pelagic, which is off Tutukaka in the North Island of New Zealand, I think it's the best single pelagic trip that one can do in the world. You can see close to 100,000 birds in a day. It's from a small boat, so if you're at all seasick, you want to be prepared for that. But it's most of the world's buller shearwaters nest right there, and you can see New Zealand storm petrel. I did that trip, a day trip before the New Zealand cruise, and it is, if you go to mainland New Zealand, and you can head up there and be there from Auckland in a couple hours, and it's an amazing trip that they've got out there. This is one of the non-bird critters that I saw. This was not alive, but this pictured here is a giant squid. That I was looking down at a light-mantled sooty albatross nest, and I thought that would be the coolest thing I saw all day for sure. And just below that was this giant squid, which is about 30 feet long, and it was very much dead, but it was still cool to see because it'll certainly be the only giant squid. I'm not going to dive to the depths with the sperm whales probably ever to have a chance to see one. But these were some of the other highlights I mentioned. Seeing a magenta petrel on that new sub-Antarctic Islands cruise in the Manx Shearwater and the Galapagos. We had a big dove-key day off Ocean City, Maryland, a couple of years ago. We had over 5,000 dove-keys one day. It was incredible. So I think that is most of it. But yeah, one of the best pelagic days I ever had was right here in Philadelphia. And there was, I think the only tube nose we had was the Leach's Storm-Petrel. But man, definitely probably it was the most thrilling birding day I've ever been a part of. Who else was here for Hurricane Sandy? Marty, you were here. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a crazy day. Yeah. Most days you see any one of those birds, it'd be a really good day in Philly. Seeing them all was nuts. And we had a great congregation of birds, in part because the coast was so messed up because of the hurricane. You couldn't really get to the coast. So a lot of birders ended up here in Philly that weren't even from Philly, that were really, really good, skilled birders too. And so we had a lot of eyes, saw a lot of stuff. That was a really cool one. These are the couple of books that I recommend if you really want to study up on seabirds some more. And these are both great. Steve Howell, Oceanic Birds of the World with Kirk Zufelt, and then the Peter Harrison book, which he did with Martin Perrow and Hans Larsen in this updated 2021 version, which is the new identification
Yeah,
guide.
all three of those.
Is that right? Nice. Was that on Flock at Sea? Flock to Marion. Yeah, nice. He's actually going to be on our subantarctic cruise, I think, as well. Yeah.
So, Peter?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a wrap for now. I could go on talking about seabirds all day, but thanks for listening. And if you want to have any questions about seabirds, I can try to answer those, or questions about general birding or travel or what have you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
Any theories on why some of these bird species nest on one island?
I think some of them probably started out nesting more widespread, but as time has gone on, they ended up on these few places. But yeah, I mean, there's so many of them that have. I'm sure as time, like if you think about if you're evolving breeding on this one piece of land, you're pretty isolated there. Like a lot of these albatrosses, these big albatrosses, they own the same thing. They breed on just a couple islands, and they look pretty much identical, but genetically they're starting to look pretty different from each other. A lot of them are differentiating and, becoming more and more different from one another. It looks like within the wandering albatross group, at least. But and I think it's because they are so isolated. But how it started initially, I'm sure some of it has to do with ice age and these islands being covered in ice or exposed, and there's probably colonizations at different points historically. But I'm not sure exactly. I don't know how to answer that
That's how species evolve and become separated from each other by reproductive isolation.
Yeah, it's true.
Since are so rare to find and come by, so if you're like reproductively successful, it pays off evolutionarily speaking to have flexibility because it works. A lot of those young birds actually are rewarded by coming back because their parents bred there. They know it works. So by coming back there instead of going off somewhere else where there's rats or other predators or unsuitable habitat, that's how they just reinforce that. That's how they isolate, and then you have different species that look the same, but they're breed only on these islands for tens of thousands of years, and they look the same, but now they're splitting them all because genetically speaking, they haven't really interbred at least centuries.
I know for certain birds like Bermuda petrel, that used to be a much more widespread bird. They found fossil evidence of that bird in many other places across the Atlantic, and I think short-tailed albatrosses actually also might have even been in the Atlantic. So I think a lot of them, if it works, they keep doing it. But a lot of them might have actually been more widespread and just ended up in these spots that have worked, and might have been out competed at other spots.
Would they pelagic birds more colonial than birds?
Yeah, I mean, most of them are pretty colonial. Yeah, I mean, like some of them are hugely colonial. But yeah, I mean, like a ruby-crowned kinglet is not the colonial bird at all. Like most of the forest birds around here, none of them are really colonial. You get into situations where like marsh wrens can get pretty stacked up on each other at times. And are they colonial, or are they just have really tiny territories? But seabirds, these tube noses, many of them are quite colonial, if not extremely so.
Social attraction is like the most common technique that I've witnessed personally is putting decoys and doing playback in islands, even when there's no actual breeding birds that they will colonize within probably a decade. I personally call it Storm-Petrels with eggs. They came to playback. Like those birds are like no business at all exploring new areas. Like they have a nest, they have an egg in their belly, they'll still come down from like 500 meters, hit the net, just because they're so tuned to like exploring colonies and listening for like new colonies that are potential there, even though they already have a nest somewhere else.
That's what Steve Press did with
The puffins.
Yeah. But,
And that's one, I talked about the acute sense of smell. That's some of them navigate these colonies where there's many, many thousands of birds that they'll use smell to get back to their particular nest.
And the only place that you could possibly nest on this tiny little island, that kind of forces you to be cologne. That's it.
no.
Let me make sure.
I can find out the questions.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, Bo.
Kurt, you notice the knowledge you have about the differences in gender of some of these birds and how you might tell the difference from some of the species we've seen tonight?
Yeah, like in the pterodromas, the males tend to be bigger. In the albatrosses, I'm not actually sure if the males are bigger or not. Generally, you're not trying to separate them by sex at sea, certainly. What you do see quite a lot is they do one of the coolest things, especially with like light-mantled sooty albatross is a famous one. They do these tandem synchronized flights, and usually it's the male following the female, and he'll try to mimic her movements as best he can. And to see, I call them chocolate sea stars, the light-mantled sooty albatrosses. Doing that is amazing, and you can sometimes you're like, there's a clear difference, and like I've seen it with some pterodromas, like white-headed petrels, when I've been near a breeding area off the Auckland Islands there, where you're seeing a lot of those tandem flights, and you can clearly see that the male is bigger, the one following is bigger, but plumage-wise, there's not much. Yeah, they look pretty similar.
In fact, that's like mirroring. I can talk about it with humans that way, but other primates do that. And I wonder if that's part of the pair bonding.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's pair bonding. Yeah, it's based. Yeah, because they'll do it even after they've paired up. They do it as part of courtship, but you hear about them doing it even after they've been paired up for quite a while.
Well, if I'm in conversation with you, like relate to you something.
You're crossing your arms and nodding your head just like I am. Yeah.
There are a couple of questions from Zoom.
Yeah.
Sean asked, why so much color variation? Land birds, so little details.
Yeah, I think it has all to do with the landscape. And I meant to talk about that. So thanks for asking that question. In fact, I think it's the British Navy that's tried to mimic some of the patterns they've seen in some seabirds like prions, which have sort of this like M-like pattern on the back, because as they're flying away from you, they just vanish. Like if you watch them, you're just like, if you see them bank perfectly right close, you're getting a great view and you think it's a really pleasing, beautiful pattern. But if all of a sudden they turn and they're going low away from you, they become completely camouflaged. But yeah, all these birds are basically studies in black, white, and gray. There's magenta petrel is a brown and white bird. It's named after a ship. It doesn't have a spot of purple or pink on it. But yeah, that's the case. And I think that's one of the fun things is basically these birds, they're kind of monochromatic, and they're not super sexy in terms of plumage, but the dynamism of the flight and the structure, it just is what makes them so fun to watch and see.
One more. So, Linda asks, what effect is climate change having on seas?
Yeah, well, it's certainly changing currents. It's changing, where birds they go to places expecting prey at certain times, and all of a sudden, if the water temperature, it's been a huge problem for birds in some areas. We've seen even around here, but these El Nino events are becoming less predictable, and some of the ocean's warming in a lot of these places, and it's boiling their food. I think can't remember we talked about here someplace about the crab industry and some of the fishing industries that have collapsed in the Gulf of Alaska, or in the Bering Sea. There's just all those deadliest catch shows don't happen anymore because there's no crabs left to fish. So that's not good for a whole host of reasons. So yeah, is a small degree change in water temperature. And it probably doesn't help, but think compared to some, like, it's not like Menhaden or something where they go in there and they get them all, right? Like, they have to find the crabs. They don't probably find them all the time on those boats. So I think the water temperature is probably the bigger problem there.
Memorial Day weekend.
Alaska does a pretty good job of regulating fishing that comes out.
Yeah, I don't know. I just I guess that it depends who it is. I was reading today about how there's a new congressperson running because she's furious at how they've destroyed the fishing industry there, but I don't know enough to say. Yeah. So Labor Day weekend, maybe more so. Memorial Day weekend can be good, and we do have a trip coming up. So Luke was asking when the best time to do a summer pelagic is, right? Or pelagic out of Hatteras. Well, I would say Memorial Day is the most popular time to go, but whether it's the best or not depends. I would say really anytime late May into early June is really good for diversity. If you want numbers, early August can be really great as well. That's when some of the biggest congregations of shearwaters and some good rarities have turned up as well.
Questions in the world. Alright.
Yeah.
With all the birds that are just using like one island to breed on, are those islands protected for breeding areas? At least?
Many of them are actually. Yeah, many of them are. In part because they're so, some of them are so remote. And like New Zealand, like they have this, it's called DOC, the Department of Conservation. They ruined so many places. The humans came in and colonized the area, and before you know it, there's introduced mammals and predators everywhere. But a result of that is that they've had to be really progressive and forward thinking about how to restore some of these areas. And so now there's all this great stuff that's happening. It started, I think, the Campbell Island in the subantarctic islands of New Zealand was where they did the first rat eradication program. And they eliminated rats, and within a few years, like the flightless teal had come back. It had hardly been seen for decades, and all sorts of other seabirds that were really suffering have done much better there as well. And they've done the same thing in South Georgia, where the pipit was always such a hard bird to see. It was really just relegated to a few offshore islands, the South Georgia pipit, and they got rid of all the rabbits there, and those things are doing great. But now bird flu is a problem for some of these birds. But there's been there's some really great success stories with seabirds, in part because they do live so long. They have a really low reproductive rate, but because they live, like the Bermuda petrel, that bird might live 50 years. So maybe, it doesn't produce young every year, but it gets a lot of chances. And so if you give them enough of a chance, you can bring a lot of these birds back and into good numbers.
Read a comment and then go to this. It says, thank you, George, for such great job. And shearwater is called the Anglais in French, literally the pocket of shearwater. I know why. Carol's question. How much risk is there of the islands where the seabirds' nest disappearing? Will enough islands that are currently larger become uninhabitable by humans and so become more suitable for birds?
Yeah, I think it depends. A lot of these birds nest in the highlands. They would nest above areas where sea level. I think there would be other problems that would hit them before the sea level rise. Other climate change issues, like we've talked about, warming oceans or, overfishing of certain fisheries and areas, pollution. I don't think there's too many tube nose species I can think of that nest low enough that, some of these low-lying islands in the Pacific, like in Midway, there might be some birds there, maybe like Bannerman shearwater. I don't know what the island's like where that thing breeds. They might be low enough that they could get hit by sea level rise. But I'd say climate change overall and overfishing and pollution are bigger issues for a lot of these species.
Fishing lines for albatross too, they get called fishing lines more so for the fish because they eat squid and other surface things. Fish issues, fishing lines, species.
Fishing practices.
Sorry, you can unmute. Your head, right?
Hi. Thanks so much, George. Fantastic presentation. I love seabirds, and this made me love them even more. Two questions. First is, what is your favorite non-bird sighting on a pelagic? And second question, it seems like a lot of more southern species have been increasingly reported, like off the coast of the mid-Atlantic. Like I'm thinking specifically of like the white-faced storm-petrels, like brown and sooty terns and stuff. How much do we think that that's because of increased observation effort versus like warming waters, pushing them further north?
Yeah, sooty tern in particular is a good question because I don't really understand. They seem to be turning up more. Like bridal tern was the one we always kind of expected to get in August up here, and more it feels like we're seeing sooties. So I'm not sure why that is going on in particular. Good. You guys go secure the bar space. Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely more observer effort, like what's been going on off Hatteras, what Pattison's been doing down there with Kate Sutherland now for decades. They have a really good set of data. They've been doing the same route. They're really conscientious about the way they keep their data. And they're both really exceptional ornithologists, biologists, and naturalists. So that's an area that has seen a lot of attention, and they can speak really expertly on a lot of the trends that we see up here. One thing that we don't see here much anymore is black-legged kittiwake. Used to be if you did a pelagic in winter here, you would see hundreds of kittiwakes on just about every trip. And now we see from 0 to 15 usually, and often 0. And I think part of that is that they've been hit negatively in their some of the fisheries and where they breed. But it may be kind of the other side of the coin that you're talking about in terms of climate change. It might be that some of them are just staying further north. But there's more effort than there was before. But honestly, where we're going, there's not that much more birding effort. There's probably more fishing effort than there's ever been. And there's probably some stuff that's getting picked up on phones and stuff, but not as much as you might think. We're only managing a few pelagics really off the mid-Atlantic states a year. And there's some months where there's basically none. Quite a few months where there's none. It would be really interesting to have more effort overall. For favorite non-bird pelagic sighting, that is a really good question. Honestly, probably that sperm whale that I mentioned initially would probably be up there. But there's also the pseudorca, these false killer whales, and that I've seen just twice. They're in the blackfish group with pilot whales, and I do remember that the first time I saw those, I saw them from a great distance, and I remember being like, I would not want to be in the water with those things. Usually whales, you almost want to get in the water and kind of pal around with them. They just seem like they'd be cool guys to hang out with. But pseudorca, I saw those. I was like, oh man, those they have an attitude that I found scary, but also made it really thrilling to see them the 2 times I've seen them off North Carolina.
Northern one.
We had one on one of our Hillstar pelagics. The same day we had the 5,000 plus dovekie, we were coming back into shore, and we had a northern right whale. So yeah, one of the rarest mammals in the world. And that was really a shock and a surprise. That was pretty cool. That's the only one I've seen on pelagic. I've seen them from shore in Cape Cod a couple times. Anyway, I don't want to throw on too long. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, sure.
The seabirds being colonial have more land.
Do they have more land-based? Sorry, where is that?
These seabirds being colonial have more land-based.
Actually, most of them evolved with no predators, and that's the problem, right? Is that they have introduced predators like stoats and rats and other things that will eat eggs and young. But almost all of them evolved in areas where they had no predators, and offshore, the biggest problems they would run into would be disease and starvation. Those are their biggest threats, really.
Thank you.
Thanks.